For 23 years, my parents hid the truth. I found out that my mother had heeded my father, and they begged me not to leave. But then if there's one thing I've learned about families, it's that everyone's got something to hide. I just never thought that everyone would include my own parents. I'm Clara Monroe, the youngest in the Monroe family, and I've always prided myself on being the observant one. I'm the one who remembers birthdays, who notices when someone's mood is off, who can tell when things aren't quite right. But I never saw this coming. It all started with a dusty old letter. I was helping my mom clean out the attic one rainy afternoon. She'd been on a cleaning spree ever since my older brother Ethan moved back in temporarily after his divorce. We were moving boxes and sorting through old things when I spotted a box in the corner, half hidden under an old quilt. The box wasn't labeled, and I couldn't remember ever seeing it before. "Hey, Mom, what's this?" I asked, dragging the box into the light. My mom, Margaret, glanced over, and for a moment, a strange expression crossed her face, something between shock and fear. But she quickly composed herself and shrugged. "Just some old papers, I think. Probably your grandpa's," she said, her tone too casual. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me. As soon as she left the attic to get more trash bags, I tore the box open. Most of it was boring old stuff. Receipts, faded photographs, letters from people I'd never heard of. But then I found it. A single envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside, my heart pounding even though I had no reason to expect anything exciting. The letter was from my grandfather. It wasn't a typical "I love you" or "I miss you" kind of note. It was more like a confession, filled with cryptic phrases and warnings. The part that really caught my eye was this: "The truth will tear us apart, but it must be known." I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew enough to realize that this wasn't a letter my mom would have wanted me to find. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, and I quickly folded the letter, stuffing it into my pocket before she could see it. After we finished cleaning, I went straight to Ethan's room. He was sprawled on his bed, scrolling through his phone and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I tossed the letter onto his lap, and he looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What's this?" he asked. "Read it," I replied, crossing my arms. I watched his expression change as he read, his eyes narrowing and his brow furrowing. "What the hell does this mean?" he muttered, looking up at me. "Is this some kind of joke?" I shook my head. "I found it in the attic, in one of Grandpa's old boxes. Mom saw the box and acted weird about it, but she didn't say anything. I think she knows something." Ethan set the letter aside and sat up, rubbing his temples. "You know how Mom is. She's always been secretive, but this feels different. Like there's something she doesn't want us to know." "Exactly," I said, feeling a surge of vindication. "I think we should try to figure it out. I mean, what could be so bad that Grandpa would warn us about it in a letter?" Ethan looked at me, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He had always been the protector in our family, the one who tried to shield me from anything bad. But now, it was like he was finally realizing that maybe he couldn't protect me from everything. "All right," he said, nodding slowly, "but we need to be careful. If this is something Mom doesn't want us to know, she's going to try to stop us." We decided to start by searching the attic again, this time with a more focused eye. While we sifted through boxes and old trunks, we found a collection of photos that didn't make sense. In one, our father, Thomas, was standing beside a woman who wasn't our mom. They looked happy, almost too happy, like they were more than just friends. The photo was dated a year before I was born. "Who is this?" I asked, holding up the photo. Ethan took it, examining it closely. "I don't know. I've never seen her before," he replied, looking troubled. "But judging by the way they're standing, I'd say this wasn't just a casual acquaintance." We found more photos, some with the same woman, some with different people we didn't recognize. It was like a whole other life our father had led, one we knew nothing about. I felt a growing sense of unease as we continued to dig through the evidence. What else had they hidden from us? That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Ethan and I stayed up, talking about what we'd found. We speculated about the possibilities, our theories growing wilder with each passing hour. Could Dad have had an affair? Did he have another family somewhere? The more we talked, the more paranoid we became, until we were almost convinced that our entire childhood had been a lie. By the time morning came, we were exhausted but determined. We agreed that we needed to confront our parents, but not yet. We had to gather more information to make sure we knew what we were dealing with. We decided to pay a visit to Aunt Helen, our mom's sister, who had always been a little distant from the rest of the family. We figured if anyone knew the truth, it would be her. When we arrived at Aunt Helen's house, she seemed surprised to see us, but she welcomed us in. I could tell she was wary, though, glancing between Ethan and me like she was trying to figure out why we were there. After some small talk, I decided to cut to the chase. Aunt Helen, do you know anything about Dad's past? Or about Grandpa's letter? I asked, watching her reaction closely. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. Why are you asking about that? We found a letter in the attic, Ethan explained. It seemed important. And we found some photos, too. Photos of Dad with another woman. We need to know what's going on. Helen looked at us, her expression unreadable. Your mother should be the one to tell you this, she finally said, shaking her head. She won't, I replied, feeling frustration bubble up inside me. Please, Aunt Helen, we just want to know the truth. She let out a long sigh and leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant as she began to speak. Your parents have been through more than you know. There were things that happened before you were born, things that they buried for the sake of the family. But some things can't stay buried forever. I leaned forward, my heart racing. What things? Your father and mother both made mistakes, she continued, choosing her words carefully. Mistakes that nearly tore them apart. There was a time when they weren't sure they could stay together, but they decided to try for the sake of you kids. But those wounds never really healed. They've just been pretending they did. I glanced at Ethan, who looked as bewildered as I felt. Does this have to do with the woman in the photos? He asked. Helen nodded slowly. Yes, and more than that. But it's not my place to say. I can tell you this much. The woman you saw in the photos was a part of your father's life before he married your mother. And there was a time when your mother wasn't sure she could forgive him for it. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was more than I'd ever expected, and yet, it felt like we were only scratching the surface. What else had they hidden from us? And how could we ever trust them again, knowing what we now knew? We left Aunt Helen's house with more questions than answers, our minds racing as we tried to piece together the fragments of our parents' past. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a darkness that threatened to swallow us whole. But there was no turning back now. We had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. As we drove home, Ethan glanced over at me. Are you ready for this? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. I don't think we have a choice. Whatever's going on, we need to know. We can't live in the dark forever. After our unsettling visit to Aunt Helen, Ethan and I were left reeling with unanswered questions. I could feel the weight of our parents' secrets bearing down on us, and it was like we were stuck in a maze, searching for clues that would lead us out. What Aunt Helen had hinted at was enough to disturb our already fragile sense of trust in our parents, but she hadn't given us the full story. It was clear that we needed to keep digging. For the next few days, we acted normal around our parents, but tension simmered beneath the surface. I watched them closely, trying to see if I could pick up on any clues that might confirm what we'd uncovered. Thomas and Margaret went about their routines as usual, but I couldn't help but wonder if they could sense something was off. There was an unspoken understanding between Ethan and me. We had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Ethan, always the more decisive of the two of us, suggested we go through our father's office. Dad had a locked cabinet where he kept important papers, and Ethan was convinced that if we could get in there, we might find something that could shed more light on the situation. I hesitated, but curiosity won over my better judgment. One afternoon, when Dad was out and Mom was in the garden, we snuck into his office. The cabinet was locked, but Ethan had swiped a set of keys from Dad's room earlier. He fumbled with the lock for a few seconds before it clicked open. My heart was racing as we pulled the drawer out, revealing a stack of documents, old photographs, and a few letters. One letter caught my eye immediately. It was addressed to my father from someone named Elaine. The name was unfamiliar, but something about it gave me a sense of dread. I unfolded the letter carefully, reading it aloud to Ethan. Thomas, I know it's been years, but I can't keep this secret any longer. I need you to understand that what we shared wasn't just a mistake. There's more to this than you realize, and it's time you knew the truth. I stopped, glancing up at Ethan. Do you think this could be the woman from the photos? Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. It has to be. Keep reading. I continued, my voice barely a whisper. There are things that your family doesn't know, things I kept from you for their sake. But secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? The rest of the letter was torn off, as if someone had deliberately removed it. I could feel my frustration growing as I held the incomplete page in my hand. But it was clear that this Elaine had been important to Dad, perhaps more important than we had realized. What does this mean? I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. What secrets was she talking about? Ethan sifted through the other papers, looking for anything that might fill in the gaps. He pulled out a yellowed photograph, one we hadn't seen before. It showed Dad and Elaine at a beach, smiling and holding hands. It was clear they had been close, closer than we'd ever known. There's something else here, Ethan murmured, pulling out a worn, leather-bound journal. It was Dad's, and judging by the dates on the entries, he'd been keeping it since before I was born. He opened it to a random page and started reading aloud. October 5th, 1995. I've made a mess of everything. I thought I could keep my family safe, but now it's all unraveling. Elaine keeps asking for more, but I can't give her what she wants. Margaret deserves better than this, but how can I tell her the truth? How can I live with this? I felt my stomach twist as I realized what Dad had been hiding. He'd been living a double life, juggling his family with another woman and keeping us all in the dark. I felt betrayed, but more than that, I felt an overwhelming sadness. The father I thought I knew was slipping away, replaced by a stranger with secrets too dark to comprehend. Do you think Mom knows? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan closed the journal, his expression grim. If she does, she's been hiding it just as well as he has. We need to talk to her, Clara. We can't keep going like this without answers. I agreed, though I felt a pang of fear at the thought of confronting our mother. We waited until that evening, after dinner, when Dad had gone to bed and it was just the three of us in the living room. Ethan started, his tone direct and unyielding. Mom, we found something, he said, pulling out the letter from Elaine. We need to know what this is about. Margaret's face went pale as she looked at the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, seeming to age right before our eyes. Where did you get that? We found it in Dad's office, I replied, my voice soft but firm. We know about Elaine. We know Dad had an affair. We need to understand what's going on. Margaret sank into a chair, staring at the letter as if it were a ghost from her past. She didn't speak for a long time, and I began to wonder if she would answer at all. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with a sorrow I had never seen before. Yes, your father had an affair, she admitted, her voice breaking. But it's more complicated than you think. Elaine was. She was someone he knew before we were married. They had a history, one that I wasn't fully aware of until much later. Ethan and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. We were finally getting answers, but they weren't the ones we wanted to hear. Did you know about the affair? Ethan asked, his tone accusatory. Did you know this whole time? Margaret shook her head. Not at first. I found out years later, when Elaine came back into our lives. She sent letters, made calls, but your father swore he ended it. I wanted to believe him, but there was always a part of me that knew he wasn't telling the whole truth. I felt a surge of anger, both at my father for betraying us and at my mother for staying silent. Why didn't you leave him? I asked, my voice cracking. Why did you let him keep lying to us? Margaret looked away, her gaze distant. I stayed for you too. I thought I could protect you from it all, that maybe if we just kept going, the past wouldn't matter. But I see now that I was wrong. I should have told you. The weight of her words settled over us, suffocating and cold. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me suspended in a world where nothing made sense anymore. Ethan stood up, pacing the room, His fists clenched. And what about Helen? She knew, didn't she? She hinted at things, but wouldn't tell us anything concrete. Why didn't you ask for her help? Margaret let out a bitter laugh. Helen and I haven't been close in years. She knew parts of the story, but she doesn't understand the full picture. Nobody does, except me and your father. I couldn't look at her. I felt betrayed on a level I hadn't thought possible. This was my family, the people I trusted, and they had been lying to us for years, hiding truths that could tear us apart. And for what? To protect us? Or to protect themselves? Before we could ask more, Margaret stood, brushing past us. I'm going to bed. I suggest you two do the same. Some things are better left in the past. As she walked away, I realized that this was far from over. There were still pieces missing, and I wasn't going to stop until I found them. I knew Ethan felt the same way. I could see it in his eyes. We were caught in a web of lies, but we weren't going to let it hold us forever. Later that night, Ethan knocked on my door. I let him in, and we sat in silence for a while, both of us processing what we just learned. What do we do now? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me, his expression determined. We keep looking. Mom's not going to tell us the whole truth, and neither is Dad. But there are more letters, more photos. If we want answers, we're going to have to find them ourselves. I nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over me. Then we'll do it together. We're not stopping until we know everything. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. We were unraveling the threads of deception that held our family together, and I had no idea what we would find. But I knew one thing. We couldn't go back now. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, and we were going to find it, no matter what it cost us. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with restless thoughts, Ethan and I made a decision. We needed to confront Dad. We couldn't keep piecing together fragments from letters and journals. We needed him to tell us, face to face, what had happened. It felt like the only way to get a clear answer, or at least force him to admit what he'd been hiding all these years. We waited until mid-morning, when we knew he'd be in his study. I remember feeling a sense of dread as we approached the door, like we were about to step into a minefield. I knocked, and we waited, the silence heavy around us. After a moment, Dad's voice called from the other side. Come in. We stepped inside, and he looked up from his desk, surprised to see us both. What's this? Some kind of intervention? He asked, attempting to keep his tone light, but I could see the tension in his face. Dad, we need to talk, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. We know about Elaine. We know about the letters, the photos, everything. It's time you told us the truth. His expression shifted, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or resignation. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. I was afraid this day would come, he murmured, almost to himself. Ethan stepped forward, his jaw clenched. So it's true? You had an affair with this woman? And you kept it from us all these years? Dad looked up at us, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in his usually stoic demeanor. Yes, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Elaine and I were involved, a long time ago. It's something I'm not proud of, and something I've tried to put behind me. But I suppose I owe you an explanation. He motioned for us to sit, and we reluctantly took the chairs opposite his desk. I braced myself as he began to speak, wondering just how deep this rabbit hole would go. Elaine and I met before I married your mother, he began, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back through the years. We were young, and things were complicated. I loved her, but we went our separate ways. When I met your mother, I thought I could move on. I thought I had. But then, years later, Elaine came back into my life. She wanted closure. She wanted to know why things had ended the way they did. So you just picked things up with her again? I asked, incredulous. What about Mom? What about us? Dad looked down, a shadow crossing his face. It wasn't as simple as that. By the time Elaine came back, your mother and I had been married for years. We had you kids. But old feelings resurfaced, and I was weak. I made mistakes. I let things go too far. Ethan scoffed, his anger barely contained. That's more than a mistake, Dad. That's a betrayal. And it's not just about you. This affected all of us. Dad rubbed his temples, looking weary. I know, Ethan. I know. If I could go back and change it, I would. But it's too late for that now. I did what I thought was best at the time, trying to keep our family together. I thought if I just ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't go away, did it? I said, my voice trembling. It only got worse. Elaine wrote to you. She kept trying to reach you. And Mom knew, didn't she? She knew and chose to stay. And now we're all left picking up the pieces. Dad nodded slowly. Yes, your mother found out. I tried to make things right with her, to rebuild what I'd broken. But the trust was gone, and we both knew it. We stayed together for you too, but it was never the same. We've been living like this for years, pretending that everything is fine, when it's anything but. There was a long silence as we absorbed his words. I felt a strange mixture of anger and sadness, like the father I thought I knew had vanished, replaced by someone I could barely recognize. Ethan broke the silence, his tone cold. So why did you stay? Why keep up the charade? We would have been better off knowing the truth than living a lie. Dad shook his head, his expression pained. I didn't want to destroy our family. I thought I could shield you from it, that you'd be better off not knowing. I never wanted this, but you did it anyway, I whispered, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. You let us believe in something that was never real. Dad looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, Clara. I wish I could make it right. I know I've hurt you both in ways I can't fix, and I have to live with that every day. I wanted to say something, to yell at him, to make him feel the hurt he'd caused. But all I could feel was a hollow emptiness, like a piece of me had been shattered and scattered to the wind. I looked at Ethan, searching for some sign of what he was feeling, but his face was a mask, his emotions hidden behind a wall I couldn't penetrate. Finally, Ethan stood, his posture rigid. I need some air, he said, his voice tight. Without another word, he walked out of the room, leaving me alone with Dad. I turned to him, searching for some last shred of comfort, but there was none to be found. I took a deep breath, gathering the strength to say what I needed to say. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, I said quietly. You're not the man I thought you were. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Dad closed his eyes, nodding as if he'd expected this. I understand, and I don't expect you to. Just know that I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best, but I see now that I was wrong. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I stood up and left the room, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I found Ethan outside, standing by the garden with his hands clenched at his sides, staring into the distance. Ethan? I called softly, approaching him. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and betrayal. What are we supposed to do now, Clara? How do we even begin to pick up the pieces? I shook my head, feeling as lost as he did. I don't know. I don't know if we can, but we have to try. We can't let their mistakes ruin us. We stood there in silence, side by side, feeling the weight of our parents' choices pressing down on us. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. We had to find a way to move forward, even if it meant walking away from the people we'd once trusted more than anyone else in the world. As we turned to go back inside, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Our family was broken, but maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild it, one piece at a time. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be the same, but it would be ours. And that was a start. After confronting Dad, I thought I'd reached the limit of what I could handle, but I was wrong. The secrets kept piling up, one on top of the other, until I could barely breathe under their weight. Ethan and I spent the next few days in a kind of daze, unable to look our parents in the eye. The home that once felt safe was now a place full of ghosts, reminders of a past we never knew existed. We both knew there was more to uncover, and we wouldn't stop until we had the full story. One evening, I received an unexpected message from Aunt Helen. It was simple, just a few words. Asterisk, we need to talk. There are things you don't know. Asterisk, I showed it to Ethan, and we both agreed that whatever Aunt Helen had to say, it was something we needed to hear. She was our last hope of finding some clarity in this mess. We met her at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a quiet place where we could speak without fear of being overheard. Helen looked tense as she greeted us, and there was a heaviness in her eyes that made me uneasy. I didn't want to get involved, she said as soon as we sat down. But after our last conversation, I realized I can't stay silent any longer. You deserve to know the truth. Ethan and I exchanged a glance, bracing ourselves for whatever was coming next. Helen took a deep breath and began. Your mother and father, they weren't always the way you see them now, she started, her voice filled with a kind of weary sadness. There was a time when they were happy, or at least they seemed to be. But that was before everything fell apart. What do you mean? I asked, leaning forward, desperate for answers. Helen hesitated, as if weighing how much she should reveal. Before you were born, your mother had an affair. It wasn't something she planned. It just happened. She was young, feeling neglected, and, well, she made a mistake. I felt a jolt of shock, like the ground shifting beneath me. Our mother? The woman who had always been so steadfast, so devoted? I couldn't believe it. Who was it with? Ethan asked, his face pale. A man named Robert, Helen replied. He was an old friend of hers from before she met your father. They reconnected, and one thing led to another. She ended it as soon as she realized what she was risking. But by then, it was too late. She was already pregnant. My heart dropped. Are you saying I'm not Dad's child? Helen nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. Your mother was terrified. She didn't know what to do, so she made a choice. She kept the secret, telling your father that you were his. She thought it was the only way to keep the family together. And for a while it worked. I felt numb, like I was watching my life unravel from a distance. All these years, I had believed in this family, believed in the love that bound us together. Now, it felt like a lie. Ethan placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. Why didn't she tell us? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. She was afraid, Helen replied. Afraid that you would hate her, that you would never forgive her. She thought she was protecting you, but in the end, she only built walls around herself. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what Helen had just revealed. My mother wasn't who I thought she was, and now, I had to question everything I'd ever believed about my family, about myself. After a long silence, I finally found my voice. Does Dad know? Helen nodded. He found out eventually, but he chose to stay. He loved you both too much to let go. But that choice came with a cost. He never fully forgave your mother, and their relationship was never the same. They've been living with this burden for years, trying to keep it from you, hoping it would never come to light. Ethan looked away, his expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. So this is why they're so distant, why they've never been able to look each other in the eye. They've been living a lie, pretending for our sake. Helen sighed, reaching across the table to take my hand. I'm so sorry, Clara. I wanted to tell you, but it wasn't my place. I thought maybe they'd find a way to tell you themselves. But now that you know, you can decide what to do with the truth. I felt a wave of nausea, my emotions swirling in a storm of confusion and betrayal. I looked at Helen, searching for some comfort, but there was none to be found. She had given us the truth, but it felt like a poison, eating away at everything I thought I knew. When we left the cafe, Ethan and I walked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It felt like we were drifting, untethered from the world we once knew. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something to release the pain that was building inside me. But I couldn't. I was too numb. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's revelations over and over in my mind. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, like my life had been stolen from me and replaced with a hollow imitation. I wanted to confront Mom, to demand answers, but a part of me was too afraid to face her. The next morning, Ethan and I sat down with our mother. We didn't give her a chance to evade. We laid it all out, every detail Helen had shared with us. She sat there, silent and pale, her hands trembling in her lap. I never wanted you to find out this way, she finally whispered, tears streaming down her face. I tried to protect you. I tried to make things right, right? Ethan spat, his voice dripping with bitterness. You lied to us, Mom. You built our entire lives on a lie. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to age her. Yes, Ethan, I do. I've lived with that feeling every day, knowing that one mistake could destroy everything. I thought if I could just keep it hidden, I could spare you the pain. I felt a lump in my throat, the weight of years of unspoken hurt rising to the surface. You didn't spare us anything, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. You only delayed the inevitable. We had a right to know. We had a right to decide how we felt about you, about Dad, about this family. She reached out, but I pulled away, unable to bear her touch. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm begging you to find it in your hearts to forgive me. I was only trying to protect you. Ethan stood up, shaking his head. I don't know if I can forgive you, Mom. Not now, maybe not ever. I need time to process this, to figure out who I am without all the lies. He walked out, leaving me alone with her. I felt torn, like I was being pulled in two different directions. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to rebuild the broken pieces of our family. But another part of me was too hurt, too angry to see past the betrayal. I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not a mother, but a flawed, broken woman who had made choices she could never take back. I knew she loved us, but her love had been twisted by fear and regret. I stood up, giving her one last look before I turned to leave. I need time too, I said, my voice steady but distant. I don't know what's left of this family, but I need to figure it out on my own. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of freedom, mixed with a crushing sadness. The truth had shattered us, but in a way, it had also set us free. We were no longer bound by the lies that had kept us together. Now, we had a chance to rebuild, if we chose to. But I knew that no matter what happened next, things would never be the same. I left that day with no intention of going back. I'd thought I could piece things together, find some semblance of understanding, maybe even forgiveness. But as I walked away from my mother, I knew that the damage was too deep. There was no way to unhear the lies, no way to unfeel the betrayal. I had to leave, not just the house, but the entire life I had known. I had to start over somewhere that didn't remind me of the broken family that had once held me so tightly. I decided to move to Chicago, a city far enough from the small town I'd grown up in that I could truly disappear. I didn't tell anyone, not even Ethan. He'd gone his own way after the truth came out, and I figured we both needed space to process what we'd learned. I wasn't angry at him. I just couldn't handle any more family ties. Every connection felt like a weight dragging me down, and I needed to be free. Chicago was big, noisy, and indifferent. Everything I needed. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of downtown, just enough space to feel like mine. I threw myself into a new routine, working long hours at a bookstore cafe near the river, losing myself in the stories of others to escape my own. It felt good to be anonymous, to not be Clara Monroe, the girl with a shattered family. Here, I was just Clara, a woman with no past and no ties. But life has a way of forcing you to confront things when you least expect it. One afternoon, as I was stocking books at work, I noticed a man staring at me from across the room. He looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place him. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a kind, weathered face. When he saw that I'd noticed him, he walked over, his hands in his pockets, a cautious smile on his face. "Clara?" he asked, his voice tentative, as if he wasn't sure he had the right person. I nodded, taken aback. "Yes. Do I know you?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I hoped you might recognize me, but I guess it's been too long. I'm Robert. I'm your father." The words hit me like a punch. I had known this day might come, but I hadn't expected it to happen like this. I looked at him, trying to see some part of myself in his face, but all I felt was a strange, disconcerting emptiness. "Biological father, you mean?" I replied, keeping my voice steady. He nodded, his expression a mix of relief and sadness. "Yes, of course. I know this is a shock. I didn't mean to ambush you, but I wanted to meet you." I only found out recently that you knew the truth. I've waited a long time to see you. I felt a surge of anger, the same anger that had driven me away from my family. I didn't want to hear his excuses, his apologies, or whatever it was he'd come to say. I had finally managed to escape one father's lies, and now here I was, face to face with another man who had kept secrets from me. Why? I asked, crossing my arms. Why now? Why not when I was a kid, when I needed someone who was honest with me? Robert looked down, a pained expression on his face. I thought it was for the best. Your mother and I, we made mistakes. But I always knew you had a family, a life, and I didn't want to disrupt that. It was Margaret's choice, and I respected it. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You respected it? That's convenient. So you just stayed away because it was easy? Because it didn't affect you? He winced, and for a moment, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. It wasn't easy, Clara. I've thought about you every day. I tried to reach out a few times, but Margaret wouldn't have it. I didn't want to make things harder for you. I thought I was doing the right thing. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my emotions in check. I wanted to scream at him, to make him feel the hurt that had built up inside me for so long. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. He was just another person who decided what was best for me without ever asking how I felt. What do you do? I asked, changing the subject abruptly. I wasn't ready to talk about feelings, about the past, about us. I needed something concrete, something I could latch onto in the midst of all this chaos. Robert looked surprised, but he answered without hesitation. I'm a carpenter. I have a small workshop here in the city. I make custom furniture, mostly. It's a simple life, but I love it. I nodded, trying to picture him in a workshop, working with his hands to create something beautiful. Part of me wanted to believe that he could be that person, someone with patience and dedication, someone who could build rather than destroy. But I couldn't bring myself to trust him, not yet. I don't know what you expect from me, I said, my tone guarded. I didn't come here to find you. I didn't come here to be found. He looked at me, his expression softening. I don't expect anything, Clara. I just wanted to meet you, to know you're okay. I won't push. I just wanted to be here. If you ever decide you want to talk. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. I had spent so long trying to distance myself from the lies of my family, and now here I was, faced with yet another complicated relationship I didn't ask for. I looked at Robert, searching his face for any sign of what I should feel, but all I saw was a stranger. I need time, I finally said, the words coming out almost like a plea. I need to be alone. I need to figure out who I am without all of this. He nodded, looking both relieved and saddened. I understand. I'll be here if you ever change your mind. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the bookstore, surrounded by stories that weren't mine. I could feel his eyes on me as I went, but I didn't look back. I knew that I couldn't let myself get pulled into another web of expectations and obligations. I had spent my whole life trying to live up to other people's ideas of who I should be, and I was done with it. I didn't know if I would ever come back to Robert, or to Ethan, or even to my mother. Maybe someday, when the wounds weren't so raw, I would find it in myself to forgive, to reconnect. But for now, I needed to be alone. I needed to heal. Chicago became my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself and find myself all at once. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I would face it on my own terms. I was done with secrets, done with lies, done with letting other people's choices define me. In the quiet moments, I thought about Robert and the life he had built. I wondered if there was a world where I could forgive him, where I could let him in. But until then, I was content to be alone, to be free, to finally be just Clara. If you like the story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.